Well, so at last we're going to start setting up the facial expressions. Even though BlenRig has a very complex facial rig behind the scenes, the facial controls are not difficult to use at all. This is because when you animate, you just use some basic controllers that move the rest of the face accordingly and in an organic way. Basically, these are the mouth control, the mouth corner controls, the cheek controls, the eyelids controls, and the eyebrows controls. And then we have some secondary controllers in other layers. For instance, in the layer called Facial 2, we have some more specific controllers that let you add more details to the expression of the character. And finally, in the layer Facial 3, we have controllers for each and every joint of the facial rig. But it is very unlikely that you'll need to really use this layer. So, regarding all these facial movements that I have just showed you, some of them are achieved by using constraints and automated mechanisms, and other movements are achieved by using actions. For example, the eyebrows move with constraints, so there is no limits to the movements that you can do. Likewise, when you move the mouth corner up, down, backwards or forwards, those movements are also achieved with constraints, so everything moves automatically. But then, when you move the mouth corner in, like for example when you want to do the vowel U or O, that movement is achieved with a predefined action. The cheeks also move with an action, and also the eyelids. So, these predefined actions will work better or worse depending on the shape of the face of your character. And that is the reason why we usually need to edit those actions. Therefore, before we start editing the actions, we can define the range of movement of these main controllers. So we go to the rigging panel, to facial settings and facial movement ranges. So here we can find ranges or limits parameters for all the main controllers of the face. We have mouth control, mouth corners, the cheeks controllers, the nose frown controllers, which is this one, the mouth frown controls, which do this movement, and we also have the eyelids. So the first action I'm going to edit will be the eyelids actions. But first I'm going to adjust a bit the controllers, cause they ended up being too small. So I'll select the upper eyelid controller, which is eyelid up L, and you see that we have a couple of parameters here which define the limit of the movement when the eyelid goes up and when the eyelid goes down. We also have eyelid up follow and eyelid down follow that we will see later, but you can always put your mouse over the field and then you'll have an explanation of what the property does. Anyway, as I was saying, the eyelid up parameter is the limit for the movement when the upper eyelid goes up. So, as you see, when the controller reaches 007 in the z-axis, the action of the eyelid reaches its maximum value. You have to understand that these limits do not modify the actual actions, but they establish how much the controller has to move for the action to take place. So then we have the down parameter, which is 0.25. So when the controller reaches 0.25 in the z-axis, you can see that the movement stops there. So you see that the action of the upper eyelid doesn't work perfectly for this character. Therefore, I'm going to edit it. These actions are performed by specific bones which are located in the actions layer. So you see that these bones are not the bones from the main facial layers, but they are bones which main purpose is to edit the actions. So I'm going to open the dope sheet editor window and I'm going to select the action editor mode, and from here you can see all the actions that the armature has. You see that all these actions start with the Z-rig prefix so that you can easily identify them. And I'm going to start with the eyelids upper action. It is always a good idea to press the ghost button so that the action editor shows all the controllers of the action regardless if they are visible or not. As you can see, we have 4 frames in this action. In general, frame 0 is the rest pose. And in this case, frame -1 is the up movement of the eyelids. And as you see, both eyelids move, so by having the left and right controllers inside the same action, you can easily mirror the pose. And then, frame 1 is the eyelid placed at the middle of the eyes, and frame 2 is the eyelid placed at the bottom of the eyes. So it is when the movement ends. So I'm going to turn auto keying on, and I'm going to edit each frame by moving the controllers and making the pose look as I want it to look. So you can think of this as if you were modeling the pose, as if these predefined actions were shape keys of the armature. So the user can manually define each expression of the character. So now I'm going to edit the pose where the eyelid is at the middle of the eye, and that is frame 1. And finally, the pose when the eyelids are totally down, that is frame 2. As you can see, the eyelids have collision detection. And each of these actions have all the necessary controllers included. So you don't need to add new keyframes or different controllers to the action. You just move the listed controllers. In case you want to customize how this works, you can add new controllers to an action, and then you should also add the corresponding action constraint to that controller pointing to the action that you added the controller in. But that is obviously for advanced users. And to tell you the truth, I never needed to do that, so you shouldn't need to do that either. So now I'm glad with how the eyelid is moving. And of course there is an obvious intersection with the eyeball, but that will be fixed with the shape key later. So you don't have to worry about that now. Our main concern here is just how the bones move. Now I'm going to select all the left controllers, and I'm going to copy and paste each pose into the opposite side in each frame. So I do copy and paste. Copy and paste. So now both eyes are moving in the same way. Now I'm going to go to frame 0 so that I get the neutral pose, and I'm going to close the action. So now when I move the upper eyelid controller, you can see that I'm getting the poses that I have just edited. But if you take a closer look, when I move the eyelid controller, you can see that the movement is not perfectly aligned to how the controller is moving. You see that the eyelid is moving more than the controller, and that is when the movement ranges come into play. So I take the eyelid down, and then I make the controller match the contour of the eyelid, and I see what the z-axis value is. So in this case it is -0.034. And this value not only represents a limit in the motion of the controller, but also the range in which the action reaches its maximum expression. So now I'll set the eyelid down value of the eyelid up L controller to 0.034. I'll also paste this value to the eyelid up R controller. The value of these fields are always positive. It doesn't matter if the actual Z value is negative. And as you see now, if I move the controller, the actual eyelid matches the movement of this controller. You know, they are synchronized. The movement is perfectly synchronized between the controller and the model. In this case, the movement when the eyelid goes up is also fine, so the value of the up field is okay. And to sum up, you can think about these movement ranges as the actual extent in which the model moves. So, in this case, the upper eyelid moves 0.034 down because I set that movement in the action, and if I put that value in the eyelid down field, the physical movement of the model will match the movement of the controller. So this is not only important because it matches visually, but the timing between the controller and the action also matches. So now we're going to do the lower eyelid, and as you already know the procedure, first I'm going to set the limits. So I'm going to put the eyelid controller up, more or less to where I want the contour of the eyelid to be, and then I'll take a look at the z-axis value, and this time it is also 0.34. So I'm going to put that value in the eyelid up field of the eyelid low L and R. Now I'm going to check the downwards movement, and I want it to reach this height, and the value is 0.11. So I'm going to put that number in the eyelid down field. So now I'll reset all the transforms with Alt, G, R and S, and I'm going to go to the eyelids lower action. I first move the upper eyelids up so that they don't collide with the lower eyelids, and I'm going to start editing the action. First, the -1 frame, which is the downwards action. Again, I'm with auto keying on, so you can automatically see the changes that I made in action if I move the controller. Now I'm going to go to frame 1, which is the middle position. And finally I go to frame 2, which is the upper limit. And then I'm going to select all the left controllers, and I'm going to copy the pose and paste it into the opposite side in each of the frames of the action. Then I go back to frame 0 and I close the action. So now you can see that the action is already working when I move the controller. And that's it, we are done with the eyelids. So let me tell you the procedure again. First, we check how much we want the controller to move over the model, and we copy that transform value into the corresponding movement range field so that the action is triggered within that range of motion, and then we edit the action accordingly. Now about these extra fields that we have for the eyelids, called eye up follow and eye down follow. These two fields determine how much the eyelids move when the eye looks up or down. In other words, they determine how much the skin moves when the eyeball rotates. So now the eye is looking up, and if I modify the value of the eye up follow, you can see that the eyelid moves more or less depending on the value that I set. The same goes for the eye down follow. So if you change these values, you are telling how much the eyelids follow the movement of the eyeball. In general, the upper eyelid moves a bit more than the lower eyelid, especially when we look down. Finally, the auto cheek field determines how much the lower eyelid moves when the cheek moves. So, if you set this value to 0, the lower eyelid won't move when the cheek moves. But if you set a higher value, it will move automatically. I usually set this to automatic because you can achieve very organic expressions in a much easier way and animating less controllers. So, talking about the cheeks, now I'm going to move to the cheeks action. So, I'm going to check how the controller moves. And I see that the limit is in 0.30, and I think that that limit is okay, but I don't like much how the predefined action is working here, so I'm going to edit that action. I reset all the transforms, and then I select the cheeks action. And you see that this action has 3 frames. -1 is the cheeks downward movement, 0 is the neutral pose, and frame 1 is the upwards movement. So I'm going to edit the action, and I'm going to exaggerate a bit the upwards motion. And then I do the downwards motion. And then I'm going to select all the left controllers and copy that pose into the opposite side in each of the frames of the action. So now that we're done with the mirroring, I go back to frame 0 and I close the action. And you see that the cheeks are now working much better with the controller. Remember that we are just moving the bones here. You just had to take care about the motion of the facial rig. It doesn't matter if the mesh doesn't look 100% right, cause that will be fixed with corrective shape keys afterwards. So now I'm going to move on to the mouth. The first action that I always edit in the mouth is the movement of the mouth corners when they go in, like when you're doing the vowel U or O. So, as you can see, the inwards motion of the controller here is not enough. So I'm going to increase the value of the in field of the mouth corner L. So I'm going to move the controller and I will try to find the correct limit. So 30 is not enough, 50 is too much, so I'll leave it in 40. So when I edit the action, I'm going to try to make the mouth corner of the character reach that position. So now I'm going to copy the in value also to the mouth corner R and also to the in value of the mouth control controller. This is because the mouth control moves the mouth corners automatically. So I usually set the same value in the three controllers. I decided to have these three values in separate fields just in case anyone wants to use different values for these controllers. But in all the time that I've been using the rig, I never came across a case when I needed different values in these three controllers. So I always use the same value. Well, I think I changed it to 45. And then I'm going to edit the action. The action is called mouth corner in. So you can see that this action only has 2 frames. 0 is the neutral pose and frame 1 is the maximum inwards motion that I want. So I'm going to move the controllers in order to have a nice narrowing of the mouth. So if I go to frame 0 and I move the controller, I can see in real time what the action is doing. But if I move the controller and then I go to frame 1, I will get a double transform of the controllers. This is because by moving the controller, I'm triggering the action, and if I go to frame 1, I will be triggering the action once more, and that will be 2 times, and you never want that to happen. In order to prevent this, when you want to edit the action with the controller in place, you can use the parameters that are in the Action Toggles tab. So, within the Action Toggles, you can disable the triggering of the action by the controller. In this case, if we disable the In toggle, we will be able to move the controller into place and then go to frame 1 without having a double transform of the controllers. Of course, this is just temporary, because once we finish editing the action, we have to turn on the toggles again. So now the in toggle is in 0, and as you see, I can move the controller without triggering the action, and I can control whether or not I want to see the action by changing to frame 1 inside the action editor. So now I'm going to try to get the mouth corner of the character as close as possible to the position of the mouth corner controller. When editing these actions, I usually turn on the deformation layer so that I can see the actual movement of the deformation bones. It is a good idea also to enable the B-bone display so that you can see the curvature of the bones and you can tweak the positions of the controllers in a better way. So now I'm glad with that pose. And I'm going to select all the left controllers and I'm going to copy the pose into the opposite side. As you can see, within this action, there are many more controllers listed, and that is because you can move all the surrounding controllers of the mouth. But I usually don't do that because I know that I will fix the final deformation of this pose with the shape key or with a deformation enhancer modifier such as the corrective smooth or a smooth modifier. So you can fine-tune the controllers if you want, but I usually don't do that much, and I only move the main controllers of the lips. So now I go back to 0 and I close the action, and I'm going to enable again the In toggles in the Action Toggles fields so that the mouth corner controllers trigger the action again. And now you see that we are able to narrow the mouth correctly and do an O vowel or a U vowel in a better way than with the previous action that we had. Now if I check the inwards movement of the mouth corners, you can see that in the maximum extent of the motion, the mouth corner of the character is not matching exactly the position of the mouth corner controller. So I'm going to modify a bit the in value of the facial movement ranges so that both motions match. If I put it in 0.35, you see that the motion of the controller and of the deformation of the character are much more synchronized. So now, the action of the inwards movement of the mouth corners and the actions of the eyelids are the actions that you will most likely need to edit in every character that you do. As you see, the motion of the facial rig is already working well, and if this was a secondary character, maybe I wouldn't need to edit any other action. But well, as we're doing a main character, I'm going to check all the rest of the actions of the facial rig. So now you know the basics, and in the next chapter we are going to finish setting up all these actions in order to finish with the mechanics of the facial rig. See you!